Good afternoon, I'm Abe.
And I'm Frank. And today we'll be adumbrating Chapter 9, The Confederation and the Constitution, in Kennedy, Cohen, and Bailey's The American Pageant textbook. We start off with the section, The Pursuit of Equality, where we learn that the American Revolution was not indicative of radical social restructuring. Rather, it simply broke the shackles of British control over the colonies. However, Kennedy does point out that the exodus of some 80,000 substantial loyalists robbed the new ship of state of conservative ballast, meaning the Americas were more free to experiment with new social and political structures. The fight for separation of church and state resulted in notable gains during this time after the Revolutionary War as well. Indeed, the Congregational Church continued to be legally established and tax-supported, but in the New England states, the Anglican Church was disestablished, and in fact, it was reformed into the Protestant Episcopal Church. The Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom made it legal that there would be no state support, no state funding for any churches within Virginia, a notable gain for religious freedom. Slavery was also a large problematic issue, as the Continental Congress of 1774 had called for the abolition of slavery, but most southern states continued to use slaves. In the North, abolitionist groups, such as the Quakers, did start to form abolitionist parties calling for the end of slavery, but these didn't gather much momentum until later. Another issue was inequality for women, who were still unequal to men. There were some achievements for women, such as New Jersey's 1776 Constitution, which allowed women to vote temporarily, but on the whole, women received a back seat. A notable exception was the ideal of civic virtue and Republican motherhood, where it was viewed that mothers who were devoted to their families put forward the ideas of republicanism, that of imparting good liberal values into their kids who raised their children and thereby held the future of the republic in the children's hands by raising them up in a democratic way. But Abe, tell me, what was the Constitution like after the Revolutionary War?
Alright, so the Continental Congress was called to draft the Constitution in 1776, and it called upon the colonies, of course, to draft each of their own constitutions. Massachusetts is notable because it called a special convention to draft its constitution and mandated that the constitution could only be changed through another specially called constitutional convention. This was later imitated with the drafting of the federal constitution of the United States. And also the states as their own were separated from the British tradition. In British tradition, a constitution was not a written document, but rather an accumulation of laws, customs, and precedents. Americans were different, and many states had written documents that represented fundamental laws, and many had a Bill of Rights and also required the annual election of legislatures. All of them, though, deliberately created weak executive and judicial branches since they were fearing concentrated power after Britain's oppression. In most states, the legislative branch, however, was given some more power than the others, but some people, like Thomas Jefferson, warned that 173 despots in legislature would surely be as oppressive as one. So many members of the legislative branch also were from the recently enfranchised West, so the western part of the United States. So as a result, many of the state capitals followed the migration of the people and moved westward, as in New York, New Hampshire, New York, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. So Frank, we already talked about the social and the political situation in the Americas, but could you tell me about the economic situation?
Absolutely. So the American economic situation after the Revolutionary War was a bit of a mixed bag. There were positives and there were negatives. On the positive side, Loyalist land was seized and auctioned off. And there was no wholesale massacre of the aristocracy like we would see in France a few decades later. Goods formerly imported from England were cut off, forcing the Americans to make their own, building up a manufacturing sector for themselves. However, don't get this confused with the American Industrial Revolution, which doesn't happen until decades later. Prior to the war, Americans had a massive amount of trade with Britain, and now, of course, they didn't. But they can now trade with other trade empires, other countries, which they never could have under the economic system of mercantilism. Some trade ships, like the Empress of China in 1784, traveled all the way to Asia to trade spices like ginseng. However, back at home, inflation was rampant, and taxes were despised. All in all, after the Revolutionary War, America wasn't in great economic shape. But Abe, tell us about how things were going in the colonies. How were they coming together in a federation, in a union?
Okay, so while the US had to create a new government, the American people were far from united. With the leave of the conservative Tory element, the British, the American politics were inclined toward experimentation and innovation. However, shortly after the revolution, economic adversity set in, and in 1786, Britain flooded America with cheap goods, which greatly hurt the American industries. However, there was some hope, and because the states all did share similar constitutions, had a rich political inheritance from Britain, and America overall was blessed with charismatic leaders like Washington, Madison, Jefferson, Hamilton, and John Adams. So Frank, how did American political unity begin to manifest itself?
Well, American unity first manifested itself in terms of politics in the Articles of Confederation. The new states chose the Confederation as their first government, a loose union of states where a federal and state level exists, yet the state level retains most of its sovereignty to do what it wants. For example, during the Revolutionary War, states had their own currencies and their own tax laws, even though they were sometimes in contradiction to each other. The Articles of Confederation were finished in 1777, and by the time they were completely ratified, it was 1781. A major dispute was that states like New York and Virginia had huge tracts of land west of the Appalachians that they could sell off to pay their debts and their pensions to their soldiers, while states in the South or in the North, like Maine, didn't have this land and therefore couldn't get this money. As a compromise, these lands were given to the federal government to use and create more states. However, the Articles of Confederation had some gaping holes in them. More like the Articles of a fed-up nation.
Doesn't even make sense.
But tell me, Abe, what can we extrapolate from the Articles of Confederation? What were the details?
Alright, so the main thing that you need to know about the Articles of Confederation is that they set up a very weak government in order to avoid a strong national government that would take away the unalienable rights or abuse their power, as England had done in the past. So Congress overall was hobbled. Each state received a single vote, so 68,000 Rhode Islanders had the same influence as hundreds of thousands of Virginians. The Articles had no executive branch, hence no executive leader, no single leader like a president. It also required a 2/3 majority on any subject of importance, and a fully unanimous vote for all amendments. So Congress was pitifully weak in two major ways. One, it could not regulate commerce, and two, it could not therefore enforce tax collection. States printed their own worthless paper money, and they competed against one another for foreign trade. The federal government was helpless and had no power to regulate. Furthermore, Congress could only call upon soldiers from the states. They had no standing army, and therefore they couldn't protect itself from gross indignities. For example, in 1783, a group of Pennsylvanian soldiers harassed the government in Philadelphia, demanding back pay. And when the Congress pleaded for help from the state and didn't receive any, it had to shamefully flee to the Princeton College in New Jersey. On the bright side, however, the government was a model of what a loose confederation should be, and was a significant stepping stone towards the establishment of a U.S. Constitution. However, many still believe that the individual states by themselves wielded an alarmingly great deal of power. So Frank, did Congress follow up on its promise to create new states?
It did indeed. We saw this mainly through the Land Ordinance of 1785, which was a manifestation of Congress's ability to create new states. It answered the question of how the lands in the Ohio River Valley would be divided up, and it provided the acreage of the Old Northwest should be sold and that the proceeds be used to pay off the national debt. This vast area of land in the Ohio River Valley was surveyed before settlement and then divided into townships of 6 square miles, which would then be divided into 36 square sections of 1 square mile each, with one set aside for public schools. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 created admission into the Union a 2-step process. At the start, these areas of land would simply be territories of the United States, subordinate to the federal government. However, after the territory had over 60,000 inhabitants, they wrote a state constitution, sent it to Congress for approval, and, if approved, they would become a new state. So this showed that America and the Central Congress was able to create new states out of the land holdings it had in the West. But tell me, Abe, how did other powers outside of America continue to influence the political sphere?
So Britain still refused to repeal the navigation laws, and they closed down their trading to the U.S., which basically did prove useless with U.S. smuggling. The British also sought to annex the rebellious Vermont, and Britain continued to hold a chain of military posts on U.S. soil. One excuse for remaining was that the soldiers had to make sure that the Americans honored their treaty and pay back the debt to the Loyalists. However, the main purpose for remaining on American soil was to curry favor with the Indians, wrong kind of Indians, Kennedy, and to keep them allied with the British for further wars in the future, if they so happened. In 1784, Spain intervened and they closed the Mississippi River to American commerce, and Spain also claimed a large area near the Gulf of New Mexico that had been ceded to the U.S. by Britain earlier on. So both Spain and England, while encouraging the Indian tribes to be restless, prevented the U.S. from controlling over half of the U.S.'s territory. Even France, the ally of the U.S. during the Revolutionary War, demanded payment of U.S. debts from the Revolutionary War. The pirates of the North African states, including the arrogant Dey of Algiers, ravaged the U.S. ships in the area and enslaved Yankee sailors. The Americans had previously been protected when the British paid the pirates off, but now America was just too weak to stop them. Thank you for watching. Please like,
Subscribe, and comment down below if you guys have any questions at all.
catch you guys next time.